Good afternoon, YouTube. I'm making this video in response to this beautiful clip that I found the CBC under Vashi Capellos interviewing a former ambassador to China. And the topic of conversation is more like this ambassador's experience with the Chinese and the dirty tactics that he's become familiar with all too well. Also, he points out the silly let's call it Chinese romanticism that exists inside of our federal government, the Canadian federal government, that kind of crazy, how shall I call it? Really, it's romanticism. Putting something in the context of worshiping China, essentially, or praising China. So let's just get into it.
Ambassador to China from 2009 to 2012. He's now a distinguished fellow at the University of Toronto's Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. He joins us from Toronto. Hi, Mr. Mulroney. Great to see you.
Good to see you, Vashi.
I appreciate you making time for us. Let's just start off there. We had intended to talk to you in more general terms about some of the criticisms of the WHO where they pertain to China. We didn't know that the president would be announcing just minutes ago that they're going to withhold funding. What is your immediate reaction to that?
Well, you can see it coming, and American frustration and the president's frustration are justifiable. In the early days of the crisis, in January of this year, for example, the WHO was largely using China's own words, China's own talking points to describe the situation. And they have continued in this vein to essentially promote a Chinese message when really their job is to convey information. Now, in the past, the one problem we face is that the WHO relies on information provided by member countries. And if that information isn't very good, it suffers. And we saw this happen in SARS when China provided unreliable information. But the difference during SARS was that the WHO took them on and was very critical of China and held them to account. What's happened now is China is still providing unreliable information, but the WHO is no longer willing to hold them to account. So we do have a big problem.
I wanted to ask you, because I'm certainly not an expert on this. I've done as much reading as I can about the WHO, about China's influence. But what I would note is not, it's not just the WHO who have hesitated to criticize China. In fact, as I pointed out just a bit earlier,
I think a miscarriage problem.
So she goes on about how Trump is not criticizing China. The fact of the matter is, Trump at that time was still somewhat, how shall I say, engaged in business relationship with China. And many of you can observe that even if Trump is facing an adversary, he tries his best to remain neutral. So not to instigate fighting or anything like that. Try to keep a positive relationship.
Hearing a month and a half ago, was that the Chinese response was sort of a model response. What do you think is going on there?
Well, I think there is. You're right. There's a larger problem in that people have been either inconsistent or, frankly, cowardly in their failure to hold China to account. And it's, I think, a misguided view that by flattering China, we'll get better behavior from China. The reality is that, what was happening in Wuhan in December was that there are, very courageous and heroic doctors and medical workers. China had put in place a response mechanism in the wake of SARS that was working at the medical level. So you had the folks in the hospitals in Wuhan, which is the major city of Hubei province, who were doing what they should. They were identifying this problem. But as soon as it went up a level, up to the level of the province of Hubei, they said, no way we're going to pass on bad news to the center. And they sat on it for a long time. And they also imposed restrictions on what kind of cases they could count as COVID cases. So we lost precious weeks in terms of getting the information that we needed. This is a health problem. It's a WHO problem, but it's also baked into the Chinese system. Because again and again, think of the tainted milk scandal before the Olympics, when local officials wouldn't tell the center that milk had been contaminated and babies were dying. Think of the shoddy construction that killed people in the earthquake in Tibet. You go all the way back into the late 1950s when millions starved because local officials didn't provide reliable information. So that's always been a factor in China, but now China's globalized and has a real impact on all of us, and we're seeing that to our great cost right now.
I want to ask you a bit.
I love what that gentleman said. And basically, he lines it up nicely. There are many cases that you can say, do not trust the information that China gives to you. Don't do business with China. Know that the Communist Party is manipulating everything on their side. There's a lot of information you can be fed that's fake, And this guy is foremost embedded in the Chinese ways of dealing with a partner, let's say, and particularly in Canada's case, with somewhat of a weaker partner. Like, I don't call Canada weak as I'm talking about in the context, say, compared to the United States or something like that. So the important thing to keep in mind, this gentleman was our ambassador. He's a good ambassador. And I think he saw a lot. He's experienced quite a lot, and he was able to lay it out nicely. So we'll continue.
A bit more about the sort of tangible effect of that, because at least politically speaking, one of the main criticisms that's being leveled at anyone who kind of believed the line that China was exhibiting model behavior was that it should, if we had been more alert to the truth, the borders would have closed faster. In fact, though, I looked through the statistics today, and Health Canada provided them to me. Only 10 cases of COVID-19 in Canada are from people who have traveled.
Okay, so that case cannot actually be proven. And here's why. I don't believe here in Canada that we are completely safe from Chinese propaganda and influence. And so I don't think for a second that the information that Vashi has is actually accurate. That's only some kind of, you wouldn't say a propaganda leak, but say a fake leak, so that the public doesn't panic and cannot place blame. But it's like a white lie to tell it, because if the problem with Canada is Canada thinks it's racist, or at least the government is trying to persuade people that it's racist to blame China for the coronavirus, which is perfectly justifiable since that's where it came from. So I do believe that Vashi's figures aren't accurate, not because she didn't do research, but because the Canadian research into this case is simply not forcible. It's not enforceable by the government. Who is doing the so-called statistics on that part? Who is really motivated enough at this moment? I mean, even if you were, I think the government actually would shut you down just because it's anti-China propaganda
From China.
In their eyes.
At the same time, we had the Minister of Procurement on earlier talking about the immense challenge China has created when it comes to supply chains and procuring things. So from your perspective, what do you think the tangible impact in this country of not getting a full picture of China's behavior in all of this has been?
Well, first of all, there's the impact of not getting essential information, not being able to make policy on the basis of facts. And then there's the larger problem that you point to of our supply chains depending so heavily on China. Now, in the event of a national emergency, you've got to have centralized control of critical materials. Even within NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, they've been talking about things like national resilience. So one of the things that this crisis is showing us is that Canada and other countries just don't have that kind of national resilience, and we depend on partners like China who are not entirely reliable.
What do you think the lesson from that is? I think, I just anecdotally speaking, there's a big conversation, I think, that has resulted from everything we've witnessed, insofar as people are certainly looking domestically now at what the capabilities, whether it be manufacturing or along those supply chains, are. What do you think the lessons of the experience of the last 3 months should be?
Well, I think there are lessons on two levels. So one is at the level of healthcare. We should have learned this lesson after SARS. And as I was saying, at least some of the mechanism was in place in China, but it wasn't allowed to operate fully and as accurately as it should. So we have a problem there I don't necessarily believe that simply suspending funding for the WHO is going to do the trick. I think we need to hold the WHO and China accountable. We need the World Health Organization because we live in a globalized society where people leave Wuhan one day and they're in Vancouver or Toronto the next. We're globalized, and we need some kind of reliable health system, and we clearly don't have that quite right. But the larger problem for Canada is not just a health problem or even a China problem, it's a global problem, because China is much more influential in global bodies like the WHO, like the UN, bodies of...
Okay, so there's something I want to add, and I'll bring the video to a close on that one. Why is China so influential in the UN and the WHO? I'll tell you why. When Barack Obama took the presidency, you can say anybody who went through it that from my perspective, okay, I'll just talk on behalf of myself, you could see the Americans had this role in the world to kind of keep everybody in line. And the UN and the WHO acted properly because at that time Obama hadn't yet infiltrated the states, let's say. And what I believe one of the consequences of his presidency was America actually got physically weaker in terms of influence, in terms of representing her interests abroad and whatnot, and in different organizations. And its role was essentially shrunk. So the WHO essentially fell under the next, let's call it, sphere of influence in line, which would be the Chinese. I don't care what anybody says, the US is a superpower, and China is that kind of, let's call it, guy who wants to be a superpower, but they're a fake superpower. If you were to test it, you'd see that they're like a paper tiger. It's extremely weak. So you're looking at the Chinese very sneakily trying to gain influence in the UN and expanding, gaining influence in the WHO and expanding. Like, nobody thinks about the coronavirus as a combat tactic. I do. I say China, the Communist Party of China, has already declared war on the world. Take a look at the situation leading up to the events of the coronavirus. Trump gets in. There's a lot of people in the U.S. that have been fighting against Trump to rise and to essentially heal the United States, the damage done by Barack Obama. And then when they were unable to defeat him in the press and then in all the different scandals, and eventually it came to the to all the trials against Trump for the problems with Ukraine and whatnot. Like, China is at the back of all of those salvos. That's my theory. I feel fairly certain about that theory. And you might remember that when China was forced to pay that tariff, Trump offered them a hardball offer. They said, okay, you can accept the deal as it is. You'll pay 30% of the tariff. But if you reject my deal, my proposal right now, you'll pay 100%. And then those delegates from China simply dropped the deal and went back. And I'm thinking that the coronavirus was released by China because they failed in economic warfare, so they changed the game to biological warfare. And my hope is, because nobody here in Canada would ever think it. It's too extreme, you could say. It's something, if you were Asian and you were familiar with the history of China, how it spread by bloodshed, that you'd know that that tactic is in them. That kind of to destroy humanity to achieve their own ends, that's a motivation that is clearly existing if you simply look at their history. So I'm looking at this as sort of, it is warfare. And I wonder to what degree China is going to be held accountable when this is all done. Because the WHO being influenced by the Chinese to say this, to say that, and a failure to remain impartial, that's the canary in the coal mine. That's the seed of doubt that should be in everybody when they read that, when they hear that statement. Why is the WHO so desperately trying to protect China and their interests, rather than protect the world and protect people from harm from this virus? Why is that not the priority? Why is it not? And the reason is China has immense wealth and power, not exactly power, but the wealth to buy that kind of power influence. And you may say I'm crazy for saying, but this is the Great War, the next Great War. A subtle war, because it cannot come to that kind of physical confrontation. Of course, war has to evolve over time. And if people actually knew it was the war, then they'd already start panicking, right? But this kind of subtle manipulative tactics, that kind of thing, that evil mind to destroy humanity, to achieve your own ends, I tell you, that's, to me, it's not a coincidence. You know what I mean? There's too much data pointing here, pointing there, that China's saying, no, it wasn't me, it was the American Marines, or it was Russia, or this, or it was that. Look at Italy, look at Spain, the Netherlands, that got bad testing kits and contaminated testing kits, and kits that only work 30% of the time with a 70% failure rate. This is war. I'm telling you, they're deliberately trying to destroy as much as possible. And I think that their end motivation was economical, because they're trying to destabilize the economies of many countries, as many as possible, especially the US. And so far they have succeeded in that, because everybody is in isolation. At least most people are in isolation and in fear. So, if you fail at the game, their tactic is change the game. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.